Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support us here at Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, January 25th, 2025. We begin with our dear ancestor and Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamathi, bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, will be joined on the line by Mary Hicks, associate professor of history at the University of Chicago and author of the book Captive Cosmopolitans, Black Mariners and the World of South Atlantic Slavery. Then, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Gunther Peck, professor of history at Duke University in North Carolina and author of the book Race Traffic, Antislavery, and the Origins of White Victimhood, 1619 to 1819. It's all right here, so be sure to stay tuned. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup run over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Marvin Gaye, Cecil Payne, Dorothy Ashby, Joe Sample, Al Foster, and Herbie Hancock. Now, people, get ready for this train a-coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Mary Hicks.
Maweni Ikai. This is Brother Didan Kamathi with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of January 26. We present this calendar to put into context the present struggle against the three evil paradigms of oppression: national oppression, which many call racism; class oppression, which many call poverty; and gender oppression, which many call sexism. It is through reviewing the history of our struggles we gain added momentum in the ideological wars against the three evil pillars of capitalism and imperialism. January 26, 1895. Rosa Castellanos, La Bella Mesa. She was a fighter in the Cuban 10-year War and the War of Independence. She was a captain and herbologist. She treated the wounded and founded the first hospital. January 26, 1944. African-born and a U.S. revolutionary, Angela Davis is born. She's a scholar, activist on race, gender, and prison reform. She is a PhD in philosophy who committed herself to black liberation and socialism. January 27, 2002. Wasfiya Idris, the first known Palestinian woman to sacrifice her life as a suicide bomber in Israel in protest of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Idris grew up in the Al-Amari refugee camp on the West Bank, which was constantly subject to Zionist raids and violence. Only days before she detonated the bomb that killed her, she tended to a 15-year-old boy shot in the head by the Israeli army, who later died of injuries. January 28, 1863. Ya Asatwa, legendary Ashanti national heroine of Ghana. When the British colonizers seized the golden stool, the Ashanti's most sacred object and symbol of the nation, the male chiefs vacillated about going to war. Ya Asatwa, at the age of 50, led the women to fight against a superior armed British army. In March 28, 1900, the Ashantis were defeated and placed under British control on January 1, 1902, and Ya Asatwa was sent into prison on the Seychelles Island. January 30, 1865. Dat Tesi. She was an Apache Native American warrior from the matriarchal Apache society. She was raised with great skills as a warrior, hunter, scout, and diplomat of Geronimo. January 31st, 1901. Francine Bernard, an Azanian warrior queen, was born. She was a leader of the African National Congress, the leading liberation movement in the struggle against apartheid. She was a trade unionist, domestic worker, and trade union leader, and is considered the Fanny Hamer of Azania, South Africa. She led the Pass Laws Revolt and was imprisoned and eventually banned from South Africa in 1969. January 13, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution to abolish chattel slavery was passed. February 1st, 1960. 4 African students initiated the second phase of the civil rights movement with the student sit-ins at the Woolworth department store in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. The students attempted to order a hamburger and were beaten and jailed by the whites for challenging the segregation laws. The following day, 23 brothers from A&T and 4 sisters from Benedict College returned to the department store facing the same punishment. Before the end of the semester, over 6,000 students from over 78 southern campuses, primarily African colleges, had sat in, and over 2,000 had not only gone to jail, but were brutally beaten and tortured by the racist southern police. Within 1 year, over 70,000 young people, mainly Africans, staged sit-ins throughout the South. February 1st, 1898, Queen Mother Moore, an African sister activist in the U.S., was born. She was an early organizer of Garber's Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. Later in 1933, she joined the Communist Party USA due to its program of supporting the establishment of a black nation in the 5 state areas of the South. She was a prolific organizer of domestic workers, tenants, and women in Harlem. She was a founding member of the National Council of Negro Women, Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. In 1962, she formed the Reparation Committee of Descendants of U.S. Slaves. She passed away at the age of 98. This has been Brother Didan with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. In the language of the struggle of our peoples, please join us in saying a Mandala Awaitu, which means the power belongs to we the people.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Mary Hicks, Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago and author of the book Captive Cosmopolitans, Black Mariners and the World of South Atlantic Slavery. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Mary Hicks.
It's great to be here.
And it's great to have you. So why did you write this book? And as you answer the question, talk to us about why you refer to your subjects as cosmopolitans.
Yeah, so this book began as kind of an accident. I was in the archives in Portugal. I was researching another topic, which happened to be Black women and their role in creating local commercial ties in 18th century Brazil. And then I happened upon this really fascinating document by 4 enslaved African men who were writing in 1797 about their desire to recover what they called their natural liberty. The thing that struck me about this document was how articulate they were and also how assertive they were about what they thought they were legally entitled to. And as you can see from this kind of early document that I found, and I found many thousands of others after that one, the kind of cosmopolitanism of these 4 men was already very obvious to me. They could speak Portuguese, they understood Portuguese legal systems, they understood themselves to be subjects of a Portuguese monarch. And they were also making arguments about their value to the Portuguese Navy, right? So they didn't see themselves as, I think, sort of just weak or hobbled in any sort of way. They really were being quite assertive in this document. And then from that piece that I found, which was only a page long, kind of spun out into this entire project that took me from Brazil to London to various parts of Portugal. So I'm very lucky in the sense that this is a transatlantic story in the truest sense, and that I was able to have the kind of resources and time to really delve into all these different spaces in which these men had existed. I didn't get a chance to go to West Africa, but that's on the list for the future.
How did you come to learn Portuguese?
So I was a senior in college, and I took a class on race, gender, and religion in Brazil. And it was really fascinating to me. I'd always had this fascination with Brazil as being this unique kind of Latin American space that was quite African, Afro-Brazilian. And, being a young person, I was also very confused about my identity at that time. So I thought for some reason that, the kind of more fluid notion of race in Brazil would resonate with me if I traveled there. And so I ended up traveling there as an English teacher. I took some Portuguese lessons before I went, but I really learned there in Brazil. And of course, as many of our youthful thoughts, it turned out not to be true. I didn't necessarily feel that, I guess, I didn't feel a strong sense of identification with the way people thought about race and identity there. But what I did find was just an amazing culture that was so expressive, so many influences from all around the world. And this idea of it being the opposite of a backwater, I think, is really important to my work. So I look at Salvador da Bahia, which is in the northeast of Brazil. And it's not the kind of industrial core of Brazil. So oftentimes we don't think about it that way, but it is a very cosmopolitan place because of many hundreds of years of people of African descent arriving on the shores of Brazil, first as chattel slaves and then in other ways.
Now, is it fair to assume that Portugal, which has a contemporary population of about 9 or 10 million, in its early phases, that is to say in the 1500s, 1600s, etc., was beginning to become a major colonizing power, and as a result had to rely more heavily than larger countries on the labor of Black men in particular? Is that a fair assumption, a fair inference?
Yeah, absolutely. And I make this point very early in the book, which is that, and actually, I don't think it's that distinct from other colonizing projects, because Portugal had a very small population. It had a very small population of mariners who were available to, working on all these transatlantic voyages that were traveling not only to Africa, but also to Brazil, to the Caribbean, to India, to Japan. And that required them to basically gather labor where they could, right? So there are early descriptions of, for instance, on the passage to India, a bunch of seamen die at sea, and then they would stop in Mozambique, what's now Mozambique, pick up men there to work on their ships, and then continue the travel to India or even Japan. So it's a small population, it's a vulnerable population, and they're in this moment being quite expansive in the 15th and 16th century, and then 17th century, they're rapidly expanding, right? They're trying to exert territorial control or create ties of commercial exchange with all these different places across the globe. And so they relied heavily on people of African descent. They also used South Asian labor, right, on these routes. And they also, populated their empire to some extent in this very early period with what were called New Christians, which are people who had been of Jewish descent, but were forcibly converted to Christianity. So it's these sort of like cast-off figures, right? Criminals, exiles, enslaved people that come to populate their empire in this in the early centuries.
So you mentioned Mozambicans, and is it fair to assume that these Black mariners, these captive cosmopolitans, were disproportionately Mozambican and Angolan? And if so, were there any particular ethnicities in Southwest Africa, Angola, or Southeast Africa, Mozambique, that the Portuguese preyed upon?
Well, it was very dependent on the maritime route, right? What ethnicity you would find on a ship. So the route I look at is the one from Salvador to what the Portuguese called the Mina Coast, which we would now call the Bight of Benin. So it would really be like Ghana, Togo, Benin, and part of Nigeria. And so on that route, over 50% of the people actually came from that region, right, who were working on slaving vessels in the 18th and early 19th century. And ship captains showed a strong preference for employing, either by hiring them from slave owners or enslaving them themselves, hiring men who were from the regions that they were navigating to and from. Right. And the reason they did this is because they understood all these soft skills. This is the other part of cosmopolitanism. They understood all these soft cultural skills, the ability to speak local languages. Right. So in the case of the region I look at, the ability to speak Yoruba, the ability to speak Fon languages, right, gave them a certain commercial advantage. It allowed these men to go on shore, to negotiate with local merchants for provisions for the ship. It allowed them to manage enslaved people held in cargoes more easily, right? Because they could communicate with those enslaved people who, didn't have oftentimes any Portuguese language. And so a lot of the mariners ended up acting as translators in addition to being sort of, doing the normal sort of tasks we associate with sailing, hoisting sails, or swabbing decks, that sort of thing. They were also translators. And so there was a very strong preference for using, ethnically appropriate labor to wherever you were navigating.
Mm-hmm. Were there any gender elements involved in this story?
Yeah,
for example,
absolutely.
the freed African women in Bahia, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the historical subjects I looked at on these ships were actually male. There weren't female seafarers in this era that I could find. But these men, especially in the early 19th century, when we have the kind of best evidence for this, oftentimes created, conjugal relationships with women on shore, right? So because some of these sailors did acquire their freedom through manumission, oftentimes through purchasing their freedom by paying their market value to their owner, essentially, they tended to want to marry or have conjugal relationships with freed African women in Brazil. Now, why would they do that? Because those women, any children they would give birth to, would then be free. right? Rather than creating a conjugal relationship or a marriage with an enslaved woman in which their children would be enslaved. So sometimes they would purchase the freedom of these women. They had earned enough money through their wages or through their itinerant trading between Africa and Brazil to do that. And then these relationships would not only be romantic, but they would be business relationships. So there are several accounts of, for instance, enslaved or freed African mariners purchasing African goods in the Bight of Benin. So things like textiles or palm oil or shells or forms of religious paraphernalia, and then taking these goods back to Brazil in what were called liberty chests. And then their wives or their partners would sell them in local marketplaces, and that would help them subsist as a couple and even, buy property. Sometimes they would purchase slaves themselves, or they would support their children with the proceeds of these sort of trading or business relationships. So there's a complicated world that these men are creating in Brazil at the same time they're traveling back and forth to Western Africa.
What about the Middle Passage? What insight can you share with regard to the journey from West Africa to the shores of Brazil?
Yeah, so I don't want to misrepresent the Middle Passage between Salvador and West Africa as being in some way less violent or harsh or dehumanizing than in any other, part of the Middle Passage that we're used to learning about. It was still all those things, and the people who crossed it did experience what some scholars call a kind of social death, right? The cutting of any sort of social or family tie that had defined you as a person before your moment of enslavement. So people still did experience that. But the thing that's unique about Salvador as a slaving space is that at least 50%, right, of all people laboring on that slaving ship would then be African. Some of them were enslaved, some of them were freed. About 27% were enslaved as well. And so day in and day out, as a captive on that vessel, the people that you would be interacting with are actually other Africans. And so what does that mean? That means that merchants were very keen to use less violence on enslaved captives held in cargoes because that would depreciate the value of that captive, right? It was not a humanitarian kind of decision. It was a decision about maintaining the worth of the captive when they would be sold in Brazil. It also meant that there were complicated relationships among crew members and captives held in the cargo. Mostly there was not a strong sense of identification between them because the enslaved men working in the crew had already experienced this kind of social death, right? They had started to develop new identities. And then they used the slaving ship as this kind of vehicle to diffuse West African cultures in Brazil. So they would purchase not only goods on the West African coast, they would access certain forms of medical knowledge on the West African coast. About 90% of all medical practitioners in the Bahian slave trade were actually African born. So they would import customs of bloodletting, of using particular kind of herbs on these slaving vessels that then became popularized among the general Black population in Brazil, right? So the slaving ship, I think we have to imagine in this scenario, is still a violent place. It's still a place of economic extraction, right? Profit making by Brazilian merchants, but it's also being turned at the same time into a space of African creativity and the transmission of knowledge and culture.
Now, we know that with regard to North America, at a certain point in the 19th century, there was a kind of repatriation, some voluntary, some coerced, from North America back to what is now Liberia. I take it that there was a similar process from Brazil to West Africa. I mean, for example, we know that the first leader of independent Togo, Sylvanus Olympio, had Brazilian roots, and we understand that there is a Brazilian community in Nigeria to this very day. Are you able to shed light on that phenomenon?
Yeah, so a big part of the book is actually extending the chronology of when we understand this circulation between West Africa and Brazil occurring, right? So a lot of literature has been written about this moment in 1835 where there's this massive rebellion of enslaved and freed African people in Salvador called the Malay Revolt. Most of them were Muslim. And so they basically wanted to take over the colony for themselves, right? Or they wanted to take over the city for themselves. It was no longer a colony by that point. And then as a result, all the suspected participants were heavily penalized, and many were sent back to West Africa. So we call this group of people the retornados, or the people who returned. And many of them went back to Nigeria, or what is modern day Benin or Togo, places like Porto Novo or Lagos, to reestablish themselves there. And usually that's the kind of story we tell about repatriation. 1835 and the decades after, when it became very hard to be a free person who had been born in Africa in Brazil, because there was so much police repression. However, my book establishes that, people were always circulating, right? Africans were always circulating between West Africa and Bahia in this period because of the slave trade, right? So some of them returned permanently to West Africa after they had become freed in Brazil. Others, so I tell the story of a man named João de Oliveira. He becomes a merchant. He's enslaved. He travels to Brazil. He becomes a merchant. He lives on the West African coast for about 30 years, and then he comes back to Brazil, where he's arrested for contraband, essentially. And so there's always this movement of people. It's occurring over many centuries. It's not just about 1835 and the aftermath, but it's really a sort of phenomenon of the early modern world.
Mm-hmm. Now, finally, Mary Hicks, Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago, author of the book Captive Cosmopolitans, we understand that your next book deals with the 15th century. Why are you going further back in time as opposed to perhaps proceeding forward chronologically?
Yeah, so I think it's a really important question that you asked earlier about gender. When I first started my doctoral research, I really wanted to look at African women and their influence in the South Atlantic world. And because of a number of issues with finding sources, I wasn't able to do that. But now, with the new kind of knowledge I have, I'm able to return to that topic. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that the early slave trade was a gendered phenomenon, right? There was an understanding early on of a particular value that enslaved women had. And I want to go back and tell that story of, well, why did all these gendered assumptions about enslaved women, their ability to reproduce, about their value, their social value, why did those ideas emerge, right? And how were they sustained in this very early period of Portuguese colonialism? Plus, I think I've written enough about enslaved men. I wrote about sailors, so they are fascinating subjects. But I'd like to look at slavery from different angles and explore some of these really powerful questions around enslaved motherhood, enslaved women trying to make families and trying to carve out a sense of autonomy for themselves. And I wasn't quite able to do that fully in this project. So I'm looking to an earlier period to see if I can recover those stories in a different time and place.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Mary Hicks, author of the book Captive Cosmopolitans. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Gunther Peck, professor of history at Duke University in North Carolina, and author of the book Race Traffic, Antislavery and the Origins of White Victimhood, 1619 to 1819. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Peck.
Thank you, Gerald, for inviting me to talk about my new book. I'm excited to discuss it with you.
We're excited to have you. So why did you write this new book?
So it was a long time in the making, but my original question was a kind of open-ended one, which is, when did people with lightly complected skin begin to see themselves as white? And what work did skin color do for the people who were employing it? So I began with a premise that before there were white people, there were other forms of difference that were salient and mattered, like being Christian or being Muslim, or being a member of a national group. So I was interested in precisely when did whiteness emerge and for whom?
Mm-hmm. Now, what role did religion play in this process? I mean, for example, as I see things in the United States today, Egyptian Christians, Coptics, are oftentimes integrated into the hallowed halls of whiteness. And those who are Muslim, not to the same extent. So I'm wondering, in the early stages of this process that you're outlining, what role did being Christian play in being able to be inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness?
That's a really great question. So what I found surprised me, that the first whites, at least in the English language, were two somewhat disparate groups. The first whites were described the transported convicts who were shipped out of England in the 1670s, the so-called sweepings of Bridewell, which is the main prison in London. That was the first cohort to be described as white or as whites. They were, most of them, transported under contract, long indentured servant contracts to the New World, and they worked in some of the early tobacco, sugar plantations that were in English control. The other group were actually Muslims, trafficked whites, many of whom were Muslim. Many of them were across the North African context and in what we now know as the Middle East. Quite disparate groups. What they shared, however, and this is the part that was surprising to me, was that to be white was to be trafficked. It was to be known as a thing akin to being black. To be known by skin color was not a good thing. Christians had power. Christian servants had more rights than whites. And you can see this really clearly in the early descriptions of anxiety, I should say, that colonial governors had, worried about uprisings of whites and blacks, and we need more Christian servants. I'm paraphrasing what the governor of Barbados described in the early 18th century. So from that origin, of being that skin color was a sign of being trafficked, to get to what we now think of as white privilege, took time to make and to build. And so the main argument of the book is that emerged over a course of a century in both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean worlds. And it was largely a way of, it was an elite discourse that colonial and metropolitan governors had to try to divide indentured servants and the trafficked whites from enslaved Africans. But they didn't want to bring these so-called whites into the same level of political status as English aristocrats. So that complex story really, it took hold. It didn't really become powerful until an idea of white suffering, of racial suffering, of white victimhood came into full flower, really in the late 18th century, even as abolitionism was upending the British Empire. So it is that was a surprising result to me, but it is my book explores sort of how, when, and why those ideas became powerful. So white suffering was actually an effort to silence a much more radical and diverse anti-slavery project that was being articulated by enslaved Africans, by trafficked felons, by trafficked whites in North Africa, many of whom were finding different but related ways to protest being bought and sold, as well as being enslaved.
Now, how do Jewish people fit into your analysis? They, or at least many of them, were light-complected. Were they part of this larger narrative that included Christians, for example?
So Jewish actors in North Africa were so the rise of anti-Semitism predates the study that was clearly already in place, and Jewish actors were not initially considered. They were not considered. Very few of them were being trafficked as whites. So it's almost hard to get our heads around the way whiteness was functioning. It was not really. It was not white identity yet for all lightly complected actors, nor was it really a language of privilege initially. So Jewish people were being oppressed through a religious system. And if you think about this, Christianity was a very useful, for colonial governance, quite useful set of ideas to justify conquest and enslavement. They didn't need initially a language of whiteness to justify conquest or even the beginning of the slave trade out of Africa. That came later, and it came in response to the kind of, I guess I would describe it as a broad-based, very diverse uprising from below. Jewish people were sometimes part of that, but they were also sometimes on the other side. It's a little hard to generalize about all Jewish people because many of them were trafficked by the late 18th century. Many were traffickers, I guess. So, and much of that language of human trafficking also inflamed a deeper anti-Semitism, so that the story about trafficking politics is really quite double-edged for Jewish people.
Now, speaking of which, North Africa, I take it, plays a role in your story, particularly Algiers, but also Tunis, perhaps Tripoli, etc.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that many in the Jewish community were close to the Muslims who were administering North Africa. Talk to us about how that story unfolds.
So, North Africa and the Mediterranean world more generally play a really interesting, and again, I did not fully expect this, but a key role in what the book describes as the kind of the evolution of whiteness and white suffering as an ideology. But that idea that what unites white people is a notion of racial suffering doesn't come into full flower until the late 18th century, but really until the Mediterranean context becomes racialized after the fact. human trafficking in the Mediterranean throughout the 17th and 18th century race was almost skin color, even, was really irrelevant to the way people were bought and sold. There was a traffic in Christians, there was a traffic in Muslims, there was a traffic in Jewish people. What happens in the early 19th century really is, and this is the key final piece of the kind of consolidation of a bigger story of white racial suffering, is that the Mediterranean became, all of those enslaved Christians now in North Africa became known after the fact as white slaves. And so white slavery was a way of sort of homogenizing a very diverse group of people who had been politically dangerous to empires, in fact, prior to this. But in the early 19th century, in the wake of the successful abolition of the African slave trade, you see this kind of effort to emancipate Christians across North Africa, and they become known for the first time as white slaves in the early 19th century. So that revision is a key part of the consolidation of this idea of white suffering, that all white people suffer because of their skin color. I should say this idea is alive and well today. It is a vivid and pernicious part of white racism. I think surveys starting in 2015 showed that twice as many white Americans as Black Americans believe they have been victimized on account of their skin color, despite the fact that there's no evidence of that the racial wealth gap has never been bigger in the United States. But the power of this idea is deeply persuasive to many people, many white people. But it has a particular origin. And I think that's what's really was, for me, exciting in my research, and also a kind of unexpected discovery, because I did not expect this when I started the research, and just to see how long it took, but also how and why it took shape. So white slavery in North Africa was a way also of silencing and containing the implications of a Black abolition project. Because white slavery was deemed to be far worse than Black slavery. And there you see that kind of hierarchy of racialized pain emerging at a particular moment as a way of silencing the radical implications of the abolitionist movement that was gaining power.
Is it fair to draw a connection between the French takeover of Algiers and Algeria circa 1830 and the decline of so-called white slavery? And if so, what are the implications of that?
Algiers is a really rich and complicated story. So I think that the story of how and why white slavery became the powerful way of understanding it is directly connected to a kind of imperial moment. It's the moment when a British Navy bombarded Algiers, trying to get the freedom for some 3,000 so-called Christian slaves. But the leader in that effort was a man named William Sidney Smith, who was a kind of rejected British admiral who was seeking to gain power back in the British Admiralty. And he is the one who revises the whole notion that Christians are now ipso facto all white. And so, but it had a particular political aim, which was to expand British power in North Africa and against Algiers. So there's really in order to understand its origin, it's also deeply connected to a global imperial project. That's kind of the ugly flip side of abolitionism, which the British Empire was the only entity that could abolish slavery out of Africa, arguably in 1807. The flip side is that it then used that anti-slavery idea to try to expand its military power as well. So the relationship that I'm opening up, that is others have written about, but is that really anti-slavery has many different faces. They're not all related to the heroic abolitionist project, but anti-slavery, in the case of white slavery or white slavery abolitionism, was a deeply regressive, racist, and imperialistic project.
What about gender? What role does it play in this process?
Great question. So maybe I'll move forward a little bit to the end of my book, which ends in 1819. The image or the figure of the white slave was not this idea of white suffering was very deeply connected to gender images and gender ideology. So that the most potent white victim in discourse was a white female who was suffering. And this became a kind of trope of the early white slavery discourse. And in that sense, so it summoned a kind of patriarchal vision of how to save not just white women, but also to kind of save white manhood and to kind of perfect, I would say, two ideas that were connected. One was a sort of desire for a strong masculine authority and also a strong imperial authority. And the ironies of this are that some of the most powerful critics of white slavery were female, were women, who were some of the early wage-earning abolitionist women in the U.S. North, were quite critical of white slavery, even though they were then depicted as white slaves by people like George Fitzhugh, the polemicist for the Confederacy, as it was taking shape, or the U.S. South, and a little bit later. So that there's a fight between white women and those who are creating an idea of white suffering, who are mostly men, about the status, political status, and the meaning of white women's bodies and white women's suffering. So this is the kind of divided and divisive form of whiteness that is in place before the working classes so-called emerge in both Great Britain and the United States. So white slavery abolitionism is a key part of the formation of self-described working class movements. The Chartists are very supportive of abolishing white slavery. George Evans, labor advocate and labor radical in the United States, embraces white slavery. And in both cases, the hierarchical version, white slavery is worse than black slavery. So they were all abolitionist, but they were supporting an idea of white victimhood right from the get-go. And that's a legacy that the labor movements in both places, but especially the United States, have struggled with, that it was a hampered labor movement from the get-go because it didn't quite know what to do about white women or women in general. And also, obviously, the status of black workers was, unfortunately, even though they were some of the most militant and active, they had to kind of fight for status within the labor movement as well. So the legacy, the impact of white suffering as a pernicious lie has really outlasted its origin story in the late 18th and early 19th century.
What kind of numbers are we talking about, and over what time period? I mean, for example, with regard to what we call the African slave trade, at least in this Atlantic phase, we're talking about centuries concluding, say, in the mid to late 19th century, involving millions. How does this question of so-called white slavery compare to that?
That's a good question. Also a hard one to answer because it's such an ideological construct, white slavery. And I think this is one of the challenges in writing about it, is that people have, after the fact, gone back and counted up the number of indentured servants, for example, and counted them all as white slaves, even though many of them were not known as white slaves. And the other thing that was quite striking about my book is that, in my research, was that many indentured servants, many people who would become members of the working class, were the last people to embrace a notion of white suffering. They resisted it, sometimes at the hazard of their own life. So to come up with a number is for me a little bit dangerous, only because it implies that white suffering, the idea that white people suffered because they were white, was real. There's very little evidence that that's actually been the case. There are people with lightly complected skin who were enslaved, yes, and who suffered, but not because they were white, but because they were traffic servants, because they were felons, because they were, some of them were, made to work as sailors. They were impressed actors. So, okay, so that's a big parenthetical. The answer to your question is, if you add up all the indentured servants and all the trafficked peoples, it is not as big by any measure, by any metric, but it's a substantial portion of what became the kind of proletarian people who built North America, and then became working class people in the United States. So I don't have a precise number because I kind of resisted that effort to understand it. But there are more than 1 million people trafficked as slaves in the Mediterranean across the 17th and 18th century. And there is I don't have the exact number of a number of indentured servants who come to North America. There's a good debate about whether they were coerced or whether they were free. And so that's one reason I also resisted giving a kind of precise number, because I don't want to valorize the way the contemporary right after the fact claims that all indentured servants were white slaves and are using it to silence any claim to Black reparations. So that's a non-answer, but that's the reason I don't have a precise number for you, Gerald.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, what about this op-ed that you are submitting? What does that concern?
So that looks at it's an effort to understand the contemporary manifestations of white victimhood in terms of this origin story. And I draw a comparison between Donald Trump as this kind of walking a professional victim and a professional liar about white suffering. I do compare him to one of the key figures in my book, a man named Peter Williamson, who was a fascinating figure, who was one of the first, proletarian types to embrace this notion of white suffering. He published a book called French and Indian Cruelty in 1758. In 1756. It didn't sell very well, and so he revised it by adding in scenes, mostly invented, of white women suffering. And his targets were, he was waging a kind of battle against the shipping merchants that had sent him into indentured servitude as a young boy. And so his aim is kind of politically radical, but he used these tropes of white suffering to great effect. It made his former masters furious, but he was known as a professional liar, and every attempt to condemn him as a liar only made him stronger. Because what he did very well, which is also similar to Donald Trump, he did a great job of exposing the kind of hypocrisy of elites. It's an anti-elite discourse that he generated that actually thrived on the kind of moral outrage of liberal elites. In that sense, that is very similar to Donald Trump today. The more liberals express outrage, there's actually a political benefit. And there's another aspect to the op-ed that I described. I think on the left, especially, this has been, liberals have been slow to realize that mocking Donald Trump for his ignorance or blaming racism on ignorant followers who are mostly Southern or mostly working class literally is the oxygen of white victimhood. It's what empowers Trump to be their authentic crusader. And that's one of the points of the op-ed, is to try to, use the past to illuminate the dynamics of white victimhood today, which is a discourse designed not only to police working class Black and brown people, to vilify them, but also to go after, I guess, the smugness of white elites. Both are clearly in evidence at the end of my book, and also clearly are in evidence today in our discourse and in our politics. So my solution, if there is one, one of the takeaways is that multiracial labor movements and multiracial democracies have built one another in the past. And that really is the best inoculation against the virus of white victimhood, which is an old idea. It's an old poison, but it works in part by not because it's a language of class. being used against white elites, as well as trying to divide a multiracial working class or a multiracial trafficked class in the 18th century.
Well, Professor Peck, professor of history at Duke University, author of the book Race Traffic. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
So thank you, Professor, and we'll broadcast in the next few weeks, and I'll certainly let you know when.
I'm so sorry about that phone call. Dagon, I had turned that off, but it came in. Was that going to be a problem? I'm sorry.
Oh, not at all. I didn't even hear it. I didn't until you just mentioned it.
Oh, for real? That's the great thing about Zoom is it localizes the. Oh, that's good. Yeah, no, it was really loud on my end, but I did worry about that. Sorry about. Well, I really enjoyed the questions. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Take care. Let me know, and I look forward to hearing it. So thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nobody else can do this for us. No document can do this for us. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation can do this for us. No Kennysonian or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can do this for us. If the Negro is to be free, he must move down into the inner resources of his own soul and sign with the pen and ink of self-assertive manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Mary Hicks from the University of Chicago, as well as Gunther Peck from Duke University in North Carolina. Shout out to Dr. Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Baba Didan Kamathi on the African Drumbeat historical calendar. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.